Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Listen up, because it's time for a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read Chapter 13 of the Tom Petty biography. Chapter 13 is called Court. Oh, you want to hear Chapter 14 too? Overruled! Here we go. Petty's mother wasn't doing well back in Florida. She needed extra care. Though Petty was quick to do all that was asked of him as far as helping, it was done from Los Angeles. He had a nagging feeling that the live-in nurses hired by his father were not brought in simply because of their formal training. Petty worried that his father was looking for a little company. He had already seen Earl working the fans, keeping the door wide open should any young woman want to get closer to a rock and roll experience. The son knew what the father was capable of. He wanted a nurse, Petty says, so I told him, no problem, and then we'd wonder if he was the nurse. Like, is this a nurse or is this some chick that Earl is moving into the house? My brother and I were suspicious of it. I paid for it, but I never really knew, and it was so painful to think about that I almost didn't want to know. The part that bothered Petty was the thought of his mother living through that indignity, no matter that she had slipped into an almost unconscious state. His old protector needed some protection, he thought, and he could still fool himself into believing he could do something about it, and also have a career as a rock and roll star. By the time the lawsuits were underway, of course, there was less time than ever to be a son, a father, even a friend. Ron Blair recalls sitting poolside at the Tropicana, waiting it out while Petty and his team of managers and lawyers sorted through the paragraphs and pages that defined the Heartbreakers' contractual situation. For any band member who questioned whether it should be a five-way split, there was now ample evidence that the workload wasn't divided that way. Blair would sometimes see characters milling around the hotel pool, including the Tropicana's poet laureate Tom Waits and the members of Cheap Trick, but none of them had Blair's tan. He was a bronze child of sloth. Not that anyone was asking him to do more. Ben Montench, for his part, was a regular at the Rainbow Room. The bartenders knew what he was drinking. For Petty, the almost ceaseless movement between writing, recording, going home to his family, and working through the band's affairs had begun to define who he was. He was a working man. The old gang wasn't the same because, as he put it, someone had to be the adult here. There wasn't a lot of time to give anything the focus he hoped to give it, so he cut corners wherever he could. And that was more on the son and father side of things than anywhere else. No one wanted to see the songs stop coming. They were going to help everyone, family, poolside band members, the crew, his parents, lawyers, record executives. Petty was in the Sherman Oaks house, had the Camaro, but was still eyeballing yard sales when he passed them. Things improved in fits and starts. For the second time in his short career, he was the object of something like a home stereo intervention. Years before, Denny Cordell stopped by Petty's to play him a record, only to find a half-broken little player, a child's device. "Where's your man?" Petty recalls Cordell asking. The setup Cordell then sent over from the office was better, but not by much. When Jimmy Iovine and engineer Shelley Yakis left Petty's house after their first visit, they did some shopping before going back to their hotel. They sent over a stereo with 2 JBL speakers, an amp, a reel-to-reel 2-track, a turntable, Petty recalls. That was them just putting their foot down. They wouldn't work with a guy who couldn't listen to his own recordings on a proper system. Petty's world was being tidied up. The new home stereo was nothing compared to the legal makeover that was about to go down. Tony Dimitriitz was no longer working out of his bedroom, where he had been alone until 1977 when the band hired Mary Clauser, the assistant who would stay for the whole ride. A woman Petty says organized his life, knew the right people to let in, and along the way became family. Now Dimitriitz and Clauser had settled into the offices of Elliot Roberts Lookout Management, where Roberts and Dimitriitz were ready to address as partners Petty's Shelter Records contract, which was in fact the Mudcrutch contract that Petty had signed years before. "I think I knew I was in a bad deal after the first record," Petty explains. "It had taken a year, but we had started to sell significant amounts of albums. There were gold records. There should have been dough. We hadn't taken a big advance and our costs weren't that high. There should have been publishing money for sure. Where was the money? That's how it first came up. I remember Tony saying, "It's a shame about the record deal. You're still on the contract you signed with Mudcrutch and they're using it to their advantage." So when Elliot came in, things started to heat up. They made it their mission, and Elliot put his money where his mouth was, bankrolled us during the recording of Damn the Torpedoes, paid all the legal bills. I think he was the one who came up with the bankruptcy scheme. Elliot's a street hustler, but he knew that there was no future financially if we didn't get free of this record company. Sitting with Demetrius and Elliot Roberts, the band's lawyers asked them how they were for cash. The answer? Not good. The managers explained that Roberts was paying for the recordings out of his own pocket. The lawyers then asked if the term of Petty's contracts would allow them to pay back what was being borrowed from Roberts. Answer? Not likely. Weighing the debts against the terms of the recording and publishing deals, it looked to everyone in the room like the case for insolvency was good. If you're insolvent, Demetrius says, and there's no likelihood that the terms of your existing contracts will allow you to get out of your insolvency, then the court has the right to readjust all of your contracts and deals, and you can make a fresh start. And that is what we were after when we filed for Chapter 11. Obviously, the record companies didn't want to see us win this kind of case. It would mean a precedent would be established that could have far-reaching effects. At the same time, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers were an act that a lot of labels would have liked on their roster. For all the record executives who didn't want to see this Chapter 11 case fall in the artist's favor, there were just as many voicing their interest in Petty, should that be the outcome and Petty find himself a free agent. Rock and roll wasn't a business of sentimentalists or men who got overly attached to their principles, not when there were records to sell. It all made for a strange climate in which to be making that third record. Bugs Whittle, living like he was on the wrong side of the enemy lines, was responsible for keeping the multi-track tapes in a safe place at the end of the sessions. No one knew where he took them, and no one wanted to know as long as they were there at the next session. The tapes were hidden so they wouldn't become evidence in courtroom proceedings. I was at the Troubadour one night and a guy walked up to me who, I guess, was fairly high up at Columbia Records, Petty recalls, and he comes up to me and says, "Hey, we'll give you $1 million an album right now if you sign." At the time, that was a lot of money. I was reeling. I called the office the next day and told them about it because the guy had given me his card. They said, "Yeah, we know. We're having a lot of those discussions with people." So in a way, it was frustrating to me. We had a deal where we got almost nothing, and there's this buzz going on. But it gave me more energy for the fight for something better. There was, however, not one legal dilemma so much as a tangle of them. The unexpected upshot of it all went beyond creating a better artist deal. The lawsuit revealed something about just who Tom Petty was, his identity as an artist and a man. What they went through and the role Petty played in it helped people understand who this guy was. Up to that point, they didn't know much about him beyond what they culled from a couple of singles. There was no mythology attached to Tom Petty, and he never tried to build one. But this episode gave the audience, the press, even Petty himself something to consider. Petty had to make a sacrifice in order to take all these steps forward, and that was his relationship with Denny Cordell. Denny had always wanted the best for us musically. He was a great guy. I loved him, Petty says, but there's something about those English guys from the 60s where they can be lovable people, but when it comes to money, they're just downright crooked. Not so much crooked as selfish, I suppose. They just won't give up the bread. Petty's legal team went after the publishing deal, arguing that Petty had signed under duress, was pressured to sign a publishing agreement as a condition of the record deal itself. They also singled out one aspect of the Shelter contract, which stated that should Shelter be sold by ABC or lose the ABC distribution, the Heartbreakers would be free to go or renegotiate. That clause wasn't an issue they planned to address, at least not until Demetrius received a letter saying, "Welcome to MCA." Bundle this with the bankruptcy claim at the heart of it all, and Petty was bound to spend more time in court than he planned. And when he wasn't there, he was in the studio. Petty and Iveen had by that time merged their personalities. We were both equally driven, Petty says. He was certainly on the case with this record to the same extent I was. He cared that much. We must have talked on the phone every night for a year. There'd be an hour conference each night about where we were at and what was going on. We were feeling like we were making a record that might be really good, but we were up against something bigger than either of us. I remember one night Jimmy calling me really down saying, "Do you think this will ever come out? What if it doesn't?" I just kept saying, "It's going to come out. It will." But for a time there, we really weren't sure that the legal struggles and our work in the studio would come together as we hoped. In the studio, the band was being scrutinized as never before. Stan Lynch in particular was receiving the kind of attention he preferred not to get. Jimmy made us bear down and work on our rhythm tracks much harder than we ever had, Petty explains. He had this dogged determination in the studio. It was a learning experience for all of us. The problem was that the band didn't play as well as they needed to. We made a couple records, but they weren't really the Groove Master records. They were kind of garage records. They weren't as elegant as Jimmy wanted it to sound. He had real trouble with Stan. Just couldn't understand why Stan wasn't fired. Jimmy and Shelly Yakis were obsessed with the drums. The Heartbreakers had this all for one and one for all thing. Every day Jimmy's saying, "You gotta get rid of this guy." And I'm saying, "This is a band. We don't just fire people." Jimmy would accept that for a few weeks, then it would come up again. There were a lot of problems making that record. Groove problems. There's a producer, Stan Lynch says, with God as my witness, all kinds of new dynamics that are entering the game. Everybody's got a plan and a prophecy and a brilliant idea how they're going to take what we've already done and claim that they knew what they were doing. But we were already the architects. We own the sonic architecture. Everything that you like, everything about this, we owned it. Without those 5 holes in the room, you ain't going to make that noise. You could put Deputy Dog behind the console and it's still going to sound like that. Shall I list the people who to me were hired guns? The band did some 70 takes of Refugee, just trying to find the right feel for a song Petty instinctively believed worth the effort. Phil Seymour came in and played drums. B.J. Wilson came in and played. Percussion overdubs were used to cement the performances. Lynch was fired and rehired. It was struggle and tension. Iveen finds the question of whether the conflict with Lynch was in any way personal ridiculous. "I have to tell you something," he says, sitting on the porch outside his Interscope office. "Right up to today, if you blazing in the studio, I don't give a if you're in hole. I wasn't even noticing that with Stan Lynch. I just got that he was a bit hard to work with, but that's it. The playing didn't feel right to me. That's not a personal thing. I worked with Phil Spector. Phil came behind me with a boat horn and 2 guns strapped to his chest. I had never even seen a gun before. He shot them off in the bathroom. Stan Lynch? I didn't give a... I wanted one thing. For the record to feel right. I didn't give a... who was doing it. Iveen really disliked Stan, says Ben Montench. I think they didn't like each other. I owe Jimmy a hell of a lot. He gave me a career, expanded my life in a million ways, but I think he poisoned the well a little bit with Stan, starting with Damn the Torpedoes. Jimmy and Shelly put Stan through the ringer. He's not a session drummer. He's not supposed to be a session drummer. He's a band drummer. Of course, I'm not in charge, and that's probably a good thing. But Jimmy came from the East Coast, from working with East Coast drummers like Max Weinberg. Now he's on the West Coast, working with a Southern drummer who's listened to English drummers who listen to black drummers. Like Petty, Bugs Whitell saw Lynch as having 2 musical sides. Live, Stan was a great drummer. He's brilliant, but especially in the studio, these guys were almost clinical. Over the years, they refined it more and more and more. And he was never going to be able to do that consistently. He'd stiffen up. Listen to the live show, and he's out there doing it. Brilliant. And when he wanted to, listen to Mary Jane's Last Dance. I remember Duck Dunn going, give him a break. That's what the Stones did to Bill Wyman. It's not fair, but it's not that easy. In everybody's defense, it was an issue. I remember Denny Cordell coming in to listen to Damn the Torpedoes tracks, which he had to do because of the lawsuit. It was a court thing. It was funny because he's sitting there listening to tracks and he'd be like, "The rhythm's not right on that one. Good song, but it ain't the take." He could just peg it immediately. And he walked out of there going, "Fire the drummer." That was a tradition from early on. Maybe not the second record, but by Damn the Torpedoes, start recording the record, kind of hit a brick wall, fire stand, go a little further, higher stand back, make the record. That went on several times. Mike Campbell had created the demo track for what would become Here Comes My Girl, a track without vocals Petty could write to, and he'd done it with a drum loop made from the first few bars of Aerosmith's Walk This Way. Loops, repeating a short sequence of beats, maintained the groove. You could use them like a drum machine, but they often had a more human feel. More importantly, with a loop, the tempo didn't drift. When it went to the band, however, that wasn't always the case. Tom would play a demo or play me the song on guitar, Jimmy Iovine says, then go out and play with the band. And I'm saying, that's making it stiff. We'd go for days and days. We were drum fanatics, me and Shelly Yakis. I would have stayed there until today to get what was needed, so we just worked until it got to the point where it was cool. But then, if you listen to Damn the Torpedoes, there's also a lot of percussion on that record. It's everywhere, gluing things together. But Iovine wasn't just hounding Stan Lynch. He was on Petty for more material. He wanted more songs. He went to Petty's publisher looking for material that had been shelved along the way. Don't Do Me Like That and Louisiana Rain were both older demos he turned up in the process. I was sitting with the publisher, Iovine says, who said, Tom Petty wrote this song for Jay Giles. I heard it and didn't say a word. Just asked if I could have a copy. That was Don't Do Me Like That. Then I drove right to Tom's house and said, Are you out of your mind? What do you mean it sounds like Jay Giles? It sounds like you. I've worked in a studio next to Jay Giles, and this sounds like you. I just kept saying it over and over. I could out-torture him. I could. I cracked him. He almost cracked me, but I think I almost cracked him. If the first two records took significant effort, the third was taxing on another level. It was less about joy than ambition. Mike Campbell recalls walking out the door, leaving the project for a few days. On Refugee, he says, I had a mental breakdown. I just couldn't take it anymore. It was my song, a co-write with Tom, and we just kept playing it over and over and over, changing the thing, changing the sounds. It sounded like Nazis marching. There was no groove. We got into this hole of misery cutting that song, and I said, I need to get out of this room for a few days. This is not healthy. It's the only time I've walked out of a session. In the courtroom, Denny Cordell began to see that Petty's legal team was making headway. As the opposition pressed to expose Petty's bankruptcy case as an elaborate farce, Petty was winning favor in the room. When the lawyers grilled him about what equipment he owned, Petty told them that he had an amp and some guitars. When they asked him what kind of guitars, he said, There's a red one and a black one. The judge laughed out loud. Signs pointed toward a legal victory for the artist Cordell had signed in 1974. For Petty, no matter the angst that went into making Damn the Torpedoes, it was starting to feel and sound like the very first record he and Iovine had been hoping to make, just as their legal issues were at last finding a sympathetic courtroom audience. On one of the days when Petty was in court and on the stand, he saw Cordell come into the back of the room. Denny hadn't counted on the bankruptcy strategy, Petty explains, but he went for it, and on that day in court, I think he knew he was going to lose. It may have been a sham in some ways, the bankruptcy strategy, but I was going to win with it. His lawyers figured we'd out-lawyered him. I didn't know what kind of pressure had come down on him from within the industry, but I'm guessing that other record company heads were advising him to not let this happen. I watched him get up from where he was sitting, leave the courtroom, and that was it. He called that night offering to settle out of court. It was the last day we were in there. The other lawsuit was with MCA, though Cordell was enmeshed in that as the owner of Shelter. Remembering how little MCA did for the Mudcrutch single, Petty had long harbored bad feelings about the company. When the Heartbreakers needed to play some shows in the midst of the legal battles, what they called the lawsuit tour, a tour that could only happen after Petty asked the permission of the judge, they made t-shirts that said, Why MCA? But even the MCA relationship would be reconfigured before the release of Damn the Torpedoes. In 1979, Danny Bramson, who had been booking the Universal Amphitheater with recognizably good results, was hired by MCA to work for the label. They didn't have anyone young over there, explains Tony Demetrius. They treated him like he was the young kid who knew everything. I think they also felt that he could deal with the temperamental artists of the day. So Denny called me and said, "Look, I can make a deal that will make MCA a better place for you." And Bramson did. He got his own imprint at MCA, Backstreet Records, and managed to secure total artistic control for Petty, along with all that Demetrius and Elliot Roberts asked for. No negotiation. They stipulated that Backstreet hire John Scott. A new day had come. In 2009, Petty sat with Iveen and Mike Campbell playing back the master tapes from the Damn the Torpedo sessions while cameras rolled. They were doing one of those shows about the making of a record, Petty says, so we went back to Sound City and went through the tracks, brought them up to the mains, and we were really kind of moved by it. You could hear all the care that went into that record. When we brought up a couple of things, it was stunning, like we were really onto something good. Sitting in those same seats listening to that record, I think it touched us all in a way that maybe we weren't quite expecting. It was a really important time. In the end, a very good time. Even with all the stress we had on the business side, we never let it interfere with the creative part. We were just dealing with the music. It brought back to their minds the struggles that they went through, but they obviously didn't have to relive the anxiety and frustration. Time and distance had done their work in more ways than one. As the cameras captured the scene, Petty looked to be the hippie he is, and Iveen, the corporate giant. But Damn the Torpedoes was the success that changed all of their lives, giving them the most pronounced before and after effect of their careers. Just before the very high-profile 2014 sale of his company Beats to Apple, a $3 billion deal, Iveen said, "I tuned Beats headphones to that album. It's the best-sounding album I ever did. And there wasn't one thing on my mind the entire time we made it. Just that. I was totally single-minded. I've never been the same way in anything I've ever done after. I've never been the same guy. And Tom and I drifted apart, probably because I wasn't the same guy." Well, that's the end of Chapter 13. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 13 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.